Hey folks, this is Dan Deppen, and I'm going to be bringing you two tables of PLO8 cash, 6 max for both. So on the left table over here, we got 50 cent a dollar, and then $1, $2 on the right. So this video series is going to be probably, I don't know how much of a series it's going to be, but it's probably going to be 2 parts, possibly 3 parts, depending on how much time I spend analyzing the different hands. This is a session I played on a Saturday night, and so tables turned out to be pretty fishy, but there were some interesting hands that came up, so I think this will be a good one to use for these videos. Let me pause it here for a second. So I haven't been playing a lot on Full Tilt lately. I've been playing mostly on other sites, and so most of these players I didn't have any real history with going into this session. But as things went on, it turned out that everybody's pretty loose and fairly passive, which is kind of surprising, especially at the $1 or $2. I keep waiting for that to get a little bit tougher. Maybe it was just the fact that it was a Saturday evening that the fish were out, but it's always a little amazing to me how there's not a bigger difference between something like 50 PLO8 and $1, $2 PLO8. Obviously depends on the players of the game. If you're playing during the day and it's only a bunch of regs, that's obviously going to be much tougher. So when I started the session, I didn't know the players I was up against, but as it turned out, they were all pretty loose, passive, and pretty fishy for the most part. So over here on the right, I've got a super strong high only hand, so we raise it on the button. So these players on our left, obviously, I've got no information on whatsoever. So given no information on them, I'm going to assume that they're bad and they're pretty loose passive, not knowing anything else. As it turned out, that was a decent assumption. So let's pause it here. So we flop the second nuts, and there's a low draw on the board. So we've got a very strong hand, but we're up against two unknown players. We do have position, which is good. So if this is check to us, I'm definitely going to bet this and try to take it down on the flop. But if we get played with too much, we got to realize that our king high flush, while it's strong, is the second nuts, and often in Omaha you do run up against the nuts. So some percentage of the time we will be running into nut flushes, or people will be drawing at good lows. So this is not a situation where we want to bloat the pot. We would like to bet and try to take it down if given the chance on the flop, but we also kind of want to keep the pot size under control. So if someone bets into us, we're not going to be re-raising and inflating a pot, because especially if a low card comes off on the turn, we're going to be really guessing as to whether our second nut flush is good or not, and playing for half as well, which is always kind of bad. So here he bet 6. That's a really funny bet size, and it's a little hard to interpret exactly what that means. I found that most of the time it's either nuts or air. Sometimes it's nuts where they have the nuts and they don't want to check, but they don't want to bet too big and have everybody fold, so they fold something small. And then a lot of times donks will make weird bets with just nothing, and they almost want to bet a little bit instead of checking. So we just flat call because we don't want to re-raise, because if it is the nuts and we get re-raised, we're going to have a hard time calling with their second nut flush. And then having the low come in the turn is not super duper helpful. Would have been nice to have caught one of the other, two kings, so we at least had some boat outs or something like that in case our second flush wasn't good. So at this point, our goal is just to try to get to showdown as cheaply as possible with our second nut high. And with two players against us, one of them is going to have a low, so we're definitely playing for half the pot at this point. So he bets half pot. He calls. In and of themselves, half pot bets don't mean too much, but he has bet 2 streets in a row, which does say something. and then he's in the hand too. So, like I just said, we know we're not scooping. We know there's a low out there. So the question is our second nut flush going to be good or not? So this is a pretty tight spot. I end up actually folding this hand, if I remember correctly. And the reason I did that was because there was one street to play. Now, if that was the river, I would definitely be calling. But we'd also run the risk of getting in a sandwich situation on the river, where like our nightmare scenario on the river would be if Fariak checks and say 2008 bets something small, and we're in a situation where we're trying to figure out whether or not to call him or not, and then he's able to check raise at that point. You can just get into a lot of really difficult river decisions. Because the other thing too is if we called and then the pot's going to be a little over $100, you really hate to have to call off on the river and just hope that you're good for half. That's a bad situation to be in. In general, you want to be trying to play in such a way that your river decisions are a little more straightforward. And so our downside is pretty bad. The downside is we get our stack in and the worst case downside is we get our stack in on the river and get scooped. And really our best case scenario is we get to check it down on the end and we win half of not really a huge pot. So the other thing to weigh when considering those decisions is when we are ahead, we're not winning that much, and when we are up against the ace high flush, then we're kind of getting murdered. So I like to fold. It's a fairly tight fold. Depending on the players you're against, you could find a call there, potentially, especially if you had tougher players where in a higher stakes game where the ranges are going to be a lot wider than your hand plays a little bit better than. But even that's pretty dicey because those games tend to be a lot more aggressive and you're not going to get to that cheap showdown. Anyways. And I don't know why this guy is taking so long. But yeah, so he's bet all three streets now. I'm probably going to give him credit for at least ace 3. So it turns out he had the nut flush blocker. And I think that was a good play by him. He may have bet larger, actually, on the other streets to try to use more of his fold equity with the nut flush blocker there. But overall, I kind of like his play. TSE 2008, I'm not sure where he was going, especially on the flop when... Well, I mean, I guess I understand the flop. I think the reason he called starting out, he had a good hand. On the flop, Farrick had only bet $6 into, I think, a $23 pot, so that's why he ended up just peeling one off with his second nut low. But then on the turn, when he's, he makes an ace 5 low and a pair of 4s. I'm not really sure what he was doing in the pot by the time that we got to the turn. And then the river, he just makes 2 pair on a board with flushes and straights, and that's fairly ugly overall. So we'll want to try to remember that about him. But yeah, that bare ace bluff doesn't work a whole lot in PLO8 in general, but he certainly used it effectively against me there. So on the left here, we opened ace 3-5 under the gun, which is fine to do. It's a little bit on the aggressive side because we don't have any suits with our ace and we don't have any real great high potential, and it's not a nut low draw. And in this, if I recall, my pre-flop stats ended up being a little bit looser than normal. And part of that is, I think, for making videos, you want to try to I think you want to try to get in more interesting spots just because it makes for a better video. So in some cases pre-flop I may play a little bit looser than that might be optimal. But the other thing too is, like I said, the Saturday night, usually most of the players are going to be bad, and the few players that I do know a little something about tend to be pretty loose. These guys 32, 33, 35 VPIP with not real big aggression factors. So King, King, 3-4. No suits on the kings, which kind of stinks, but we do have the 3-4, so these are some of the better kings. You're going to have this hand over here, the suited ace, 3-4. We're definitely going to be opening if it, which I guess it did fold to us. All right. So on the left here, we flop top set. Our 4-high flush draw kind of helps us. Not so much because if we make a 4-high flush, we're going to be happy, but just because if he is drawing out a flush, which if he's willing to get money in the pot, money Mike here, a good portion, his range is going to consist mostly of flush draws and wrap type hands, and probably weighted more towards flush draws, since a lot of people, if they're remotely competent, aren't playing too many jacks and nines and things that will tend to make your wraps. And so we're going to want to bet here for protection, basically, against the flush. I realize in Hold'em betting for protection is frowned upon, but in PLO8 it's quite a different game, and I think that's okay. I think I just bet out pot here. It's been almost a week since I played this session, so I remember some of the hands, but I don't remember everything that I did. And that 5 is a good hand from the standpoint that we've kind of locked down the hand, and unless we just get really coolered and he's got quad 5s, he's going to stack us. But it kind of stinks too, because it means he's not going to want to overplay his flush draws as much as he might normally have. And if he was being stupid with some backdoor low draws, or maybe had like a backdoor low draw and pair, 2-pair, that card's going to kind of shut him down quite a bit. On the right over here, this hand is not really one we want to play a big pot with. I don't mind opening it, but when you get a bunch of callers and then it gets raised, we're going to be in a lot of trouble over here generally. And the other thing that's tough too is, since we've got these two guys behind us, we run the risk of if Willis or Ferrick have aces and we call this off, well then they're just going to jam on us, and that's going to be a tough situation. And yeah, so on the left here, I'd make a smaller bet to try to entice him a little bit, and then the flush on the end is good, because if he was drawing at a flush and got a little bit stubborn, he's going to pay off something at the end. He's probably not going to pay off full pot, but we'll be able to get something out of him. So I think that's a good river card for us. Probably the best one, actually, or one of the best ones, actually. The only thing that would have been better is if it was a higher card like a queen or a jack or something that would have made a straight as well, in case he did have a wrap. Yeah, so I just bet the straight half pot. Again, I don't know anything about him, and so if he actually is a competent player that kind of knows what he's doing, and he doesn't know anything about us either, he may interpret that half pot bet as weakness and just come over the top and entice. You have some chance of enticing him to spaz out if he does have a flush, or nut flush in particular. As it turns out, he just folds. So over here, we folded out and Willis jams, which we were sort of a little concerned about. It makes full house. Yeah, you gotta be careful post flop just flat calling bets when there are people to act behind you, because a lot of times you can get caught in a sandwich and you might be able to justify calling. You don't want to get in this nightmare scenario where like you justify, like you say bets and you justify calling it, and then like he jams and then he calls, and all of a sudden you got this big pot, and so that justifies another call. It just can be kind of a downward snowball. So I kind of favor if you're in a spot that looks a little dicey like that, if you're going to give it up, do it earlier in the hand as opposed to putting a bunch of money in and then folding later. So Big Uncle Paulie, we got a little bit of information on 44 hands, and that's usually enough to start getting a reasonable picture of how he's going to play. He's obviously a guy who just likes to limp most of the time, and he's betting 2%, so a lot of times when he opens, we're going to tend to give him credit for aces. So here you got nut low draw and top pair, top kicker, and a heads-up pot with position, so we're just going to bet. That card's not so great. We could have followed through again. The problem with following through on the turn is a lot of his range is going to consist of low draws as well, and so even though that counterfeits the nut low draw, which we had, it will make a lot of others. And so when you got boards where lows are possible, straights are possible, flush draws can be out there, it's a little bit of a tough board to try to get him off of. So I'd rather check behind and kind of see how it goes in the river. On the right here, ace 3-4 king. This is one of my favorite types of hands. We're suited to the king. Obviously, you'd like it a lot better if I was suited to the ace, but this is something we're definitely going to be defending from the big blind. Don't want to re-raise here and bloat a pot because we're going to be out of position against Boyish. And given him somebody that plays 32-6 and a 1.3, that's the aggression factor, those are kind of calling station type stats. So if we re-raise, we're going to be getting called by him a bunch. Although this guy calling in the small blind, we don't know anything about him. We could probably get him to fold, but re-raising is definitely not what you want to do, even though this is a hand that a lot of times we would be opening if we were in another position. But we're just going to call here and see a flop. And we whiff that flop, so you've got... It's actually, I mean, you can make some arguments for betting out here. We do have the nut flush blocker, and there are no low draws on the board, and the wrap draws that the 10-9 make basically consist of a lot of middle cards, which hopefully are not a huge part of people's ranges, but we don't really know that about these players. So since there are two players left behind us, and our hand is essentially air, and so we definitely can't take a check raise. The odds of a bet here working are fairly low, given that there are two players, one of which looks like a calling station, the other one we don't really have any information about. So I just elect to check it down. If there were players that we knew to be kind of nitty and tight, then I would be a lot more apt to bet out. And then once we check the flop, we're going to tend to not get credit on a lot of turn bets. We're going to get called by a lot of crappy hands. So we got kind of a ragged ace-deuce hand over here. We do have the 4 to go with it, which is good. So these bare ace-deuce hands, they have most of their value in multi-way pots. So I don't really want to limp. So I just min-raise, which is just... It's just what it looks like. It's kind of a half measure between limping and raising full. I don't really want to raise 3.5 big blinds and start building a pot with what is really a one-way hand. So we end up betting or c-betting there and taking it down. Sort of an interesting hand developing over here. I didn't catch the action earlier in the hand because I was listening to myself talk, but he makes that weird mini re-raise on the turn and then checks behind. That was a really odd play. I might back this up just a hair. I want to look at that hand again. So he opened, he called. It's a pretty dang dry board. Checks around, so So he bets out half pot, which is pretty weak, and then he makes this weird almost mini raise to 23, which he's repping a jack. And maybe he was hoping that he was just reading his bet as weakness and hoping that he would fold to that little bet. So maybe he was just thinking he could get a good price. He's either thinking he can get a good price on a bluff or he has a jack. The board bricks, and it turns out I just had a set of deuces. So that was a strange mini bluff with air. But into two players, especially when he was short, that's a really screwy play. So only 8 hands on him so far, but he's played about 5 of them. So he may be a really massive donk. We'll have to keep an eye on him as this game goes on. So we have Scott Clement sit down here, and I've got a little bit of play with him, but I couldn't remember. I'm not sure when those 81 hands came from. I think it might have been a 4-ring game one time. We got no piece of that board, so we let it go. I didn't know much about him other than I've seen him on the World Poker Tour and things like that. But it's a little weird that he's bought in short to a $1, $2 game, because I can't imagine that at these stakes the money is too meaningful to him. Generally in PLO8, short stacking, in my opinion, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think because the starting hand equities run so close together, it's probably tough to come up with too effective of a short stacking strategy, although to be honest, I've never sat down and tried to come up with one, but I never saw much value in it. I think that times it makes sense to buy in short is just when you're new to the game and you don't know what you're doing, and you're probably going to stack off badly post flip, and you just want to kind of minimize the damage a little bit while you learn the game. I think that's totally fine. But for Scott here, though, he's got pretty decent stats, and I was looking through my database a little bit at him, and certainly seems like a competent player, so I'm sure he's a winner at these stakes. So I don't think he's trying to limit losses, and I can't imagine that. He didn't seem to have any funny short stacking type strategy. Plus he brought in for 40 big blinds, which is kind of an odd stack size. So he may just be playing this game just to screw around and have fun. Who knows? But overall, I thought he played pretty well in this session. There were a couple times where he did get his money in on the flop in some situations that I think he got it in a little too late, although overall he wasn't real aggressive, which is why those couple hands were odd, and we'll get to those later in the video. If it doesn't come up in this part, it'll come up in the next one. So we see a free big blind and we just completely whiff the flop, so not gonna get too crazy out of position here. So when he checks again, this is a good spot just to bet. It's unlikely he has anything. If he had a king, he probably would have bet it on the flop, since this is a high only, mostly flop, and we check to him. In the session, he was playing pretty straightforwardly overall. A little bit, fit or fold, but also competently. I think he was using position and playing some decent starting hands and not getting himself into too many bad spots. A strong hand over here, but we are going to be in the big blind out of position, so I'm going to be a little bit careful. We definitely don't want to play a big pot pre-flop. So here, there's no way I'm folding for that, but I don't want to re-raise and bloat the thing either. So you catch top pair, top kicker, which is pretty good on a pretty dry board. So we're just going to c-bet and try to take it down here. Over here is a pretty decent high-only hand on the button, so we'll open this if it... Let me talk about this for a second, just to pause it. So this is a hand we'll open because it was folded to us on the button. Generally speaking, an ace-8, this is not probably as strong as it looks. If this was PLO, this would be a hell of a lot stronger. So we're opening this just mostly because we're on the button. And so far, he's starting to look like a loose guy that may call us, which is a little bit of an argument for opening fewer buttons, but he's also been, Scott's been pretty tight. We do have a suited ace. We've got ace-8, which is basically an emergency low. So this is definitely good enough to open. Over here, we've got a good low draw with our top pair, top kicker. And so that's going to be generally a pretty good spot to bet again on the turn. Because usually we're going to be ahead. We're going to have a lot of equity. The downside is if he does check raise us, then that's we're going to have a tough decision if he check raises us there. And that ends up working. So here I fought top pair with gutter, which I think we should bet there. I elected to check behind, but I think that's a good board to bet just to try to take it down. But again, it is one of those spots where you have kind of medium equity in the hand and we can't take a check raise right there, which is probably why I just checked behind. I was playing fairly tight post flop, if I recall, in this session and trying not to get too crazy. And I was doing a fair bit of delayed c-betting on the turn like that. I think there are a lot of players who will... Well, I know there are a lot of players who will tend to call one bet on the flop and then fold the turn a lot. And so you can take advantage of that by barreling, betting the flop and then barreling the turn. The problem with that is sometimes when they do show up with strong hands, or if it's a decent player who notices that you're doing that a lot, you're going to find yourself getting check raised a bunch on the turn, and so you end up putting a lot of chips in the pot and then having to fold them away. So sometimes you can control the pot size a little bit more by just checking behind on the flop and then betting the turn. So this we open on the button to ISO, suited ace-3 with the jack. This is a pretty decent flop for us. We flopped the nut low, but we're multi-way and there's all kinds of low draws and flush draws on the board. So we're going to go ahead and bet this, and if we do get check raised, we're going to have to give it up. So now we got the nut low, but no real high to speak of other than the gutter ball to the non-nut. Straight. Or maybe that does give us the nut straight. So we get lucky there and don't get quartered. Oh, over here I was taking a look at that hand. Yeah, so he ended up having top pair, top kicker, nut flush draw, straight draws, and yeah, he had a pretty big hand overall. He had a counterfeited low and a really bad flush draw, so Money Mike was in there pretty late. Right now he's looking pretty loose passive, just with 21 hands, so he may be pretty fishy. There's a high only hand on the button, but we're suited to a jack. There's a gap in here, and that's a hand that is not nearly as strong as it looks. I think having the pair actually hurts us rather than having just a pure 4-card rundown. So it's kind of like a 3-card rundown with a gap, which is not super great. So if you're betting, you're just trying to take it down and use your position. You're not going to hit too many flops with that. So double suited queens here on the left. And again, I just elect to min-raise because I don't want to limp. I want to show, some kind of strength. But even double suited queens are of dubious value in PLO8 without some kind of low to go with it. If you had queen, queen, 2, 3, that would be much stronger than what I had there. But you do want to start building a little bit of a pot in case you do flop big. You can get more money in post flop. Reason why sometimes min raising can be a little better in cash games than just open limping is, for one thing, usually people that are going to call limp will call the min raise anyways. Not always, but you'll get a fair number of callers. And just basically the pot is twice as big, so when you do hit those flops hard, it's easier to get your money in post flop. And because not quite as many people are calling, you do get people, when they call you, to define their hand range a little bit. Because when you just limp and people limp behind, their ranges are like any 4 cards. And so that can make playing post flop a little bit trickier because I think it was it Doyle Brunson's original Super System where I think he cautioned people against going broke in limp pots. And when I first read that way back when, I didn't understand it, but as I kind of developed as a player and I played in some limp pots and Hold'em and ran into the nuts when the nuts were like really odd hands that you would never expect, I realized what he was talking about. So we're actually 4-handed in this hand. And this is another, not very strong. I mean, ace-4 is not the greatest low, and we don't really have any high potential, but because we're 4-handed, we're going to go ahead and open that. So this flop's a good one to c-bet just because it is so dry, and he's going to tend to give up a lot. And we don't really have too much equity in this pot. We've got a backdoor ace-4 draw. So if he check raises us, that's fine because we're not giving up any equity. So we don't have any in the pot right now. I like to check behind, having said all that. So sort of an interesting turn. We got the nut, flush, draw, blocker, and an open ender. And so after I went check on the flop, I think, and then he checks to me on the turn, I think I should definitely be betting this turn. And I bet full pot because I'm trying to get him off of bad jacks, or I know when I'm coming along with really screwy low draws are really bad. I'm trying to fold out really bad flush draws and some of those odd hands because most of the time I'm not going to hit on the river, so I just want to try to take it down right there. Over here on the right, we got a bunch of middle cards, which is just death. And over here on the left, a6 with a suited jack. It's not exactly very good either. So here we got more bad queens. The only thing really going for this is we're on the button, so we'll just limp behind. But from most positions, in most situations, this hand is going to be a fold. And that's not a good flop for us. There's low draws, and our pair of well, our hand is an overpair of queens, but that hitting the 6 doesn't really do too much for us. And there's no point in trying to bluff there into 4 of their players. Oops, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So now the low comes in. We're just going to try to check this down and hope we get lucky that our queens hit. Oh, I see what was going on. This guy set out, and then this guy left, and I was worried about this table breaking, and so I was getting another table going. So apologize for the confusion there. I think this table ends up kind of coming back to life, and I ended up not showing that other table. Let's look at that hand again. He played what Scott did. Yeah. So Queen 9 9 10, which he had played voluntarily under the gun, which isn't very good. So maybe his starting hand selection is a little, maybe not quite as solid as I was thinking originally. I didn't notice that hand when I was playing this. So he gets it in with King 5. And he ends up scooping. Let's okay. Yeah, so let's pause this for a second and look at this. So this was a hand where he's got an ace-7. Let's look at this from Scott's perspective. So he's got an ace-7 low draw, which is not a very good low draw. And he's got top and bottom 2 on a board that has straight draws and flush draw and a low draw. And so this is one where he elects to just go ahead and get it in, but I'm not sure that was the greatest thing. I think 2 pair in the flop and PLO8 is vastly overrated. If this was no limit hold'em, it'd be a different situation. But in this game, his stack was fairly short, so what he did may have been fine. But in general, definitely if you're playing a 100 big blind stack, you're not looking to get all the money in with King 5 on this type of board with just a ace-7 low draw. Now, of course, Willis over here is completely overplaying aces. Getting aces in on this flop is pretty much suicide because you're pretty much never in good shape. If you are ahead, you're ahead by like a little bit, and there are a lot of times where you're just getting crushed, either crushed by sets or you got 2 pairs that have you hurt pretty good, or monster draws where Willis can be in really bad shape. So I think both of these guys probably overplayed this flop a little bit, although he only had, looks like, $50 when they started, so the money was pretty short, so maybe that was okay. There was another hand in this session where Scott had 2 pair on the flop and got a lot of money in a spot where it didn't look that super great. So let me pause this for a second and I'll pull up Pro Poker Tools and we'll run through some equities here real quick. Alright, so I brought Pro Poker Tools up. So let's look at this from Scott's perspective. So I put in the board and his hand 7 ace 5 king. So if he's up against a pair of aces, which is essentially what Willis has, so he's ahead 58%, which is actually pretty good. But even if you give Willis just a bare ace king with some other cards, I think that went. He's only 53%, and he's even got ace king himself, so that's not great. And if you give him, say one of these are a low, I'm just trying to think of reasonable hands that he may hold, you're actually 50-50. So not having a real credible low draw really hurts him quite a bit. Or let's look at a big draw like 3-4, diamond, diamond. And there he's actually behind some. So in his case, the money was short, so it was probably okay just to stick it in. But if you were a decent bit deeper, you'd want to proceed with caution and try to keep the pot size under control and see what happens on the turn, since the equities are going to diverge a lot. Once you get to the turn, you're going to know where you stand. Let's think about this from Willis's perspective here for a second. So you got the overpair of aces. I mean, what are the hands that you're likely going to be up against? Well, likely, let's say, a couple lows plus a pair. So that's low, low, 6, whatever. And there he's actually behind with the aces. Let's take out this pair and just give him any 2 low cards. And there he's only 52%. So 2 of those low cards could be the 6 and the 5, and he could even be counterfeited. So bare aces on this board is not going to be very good overall. And so let's put in the actual hand that Scott had. Let's see where these guys stood when they got it in. And actually Scott should be somewhat ahead. Well, he's going to be a lot ahead because he has 2 pair. So yeah, so Scott's actually 75-25. So in that case, Willis was pretty well crushed overall. And you know, he didn't have a very good low. What if he had, let's see, what if the 2 aces run against 2 pair with no low? Or 2 pair in random hands. He'll be a little better, but still behind. So I think both these guys overplayed their hands a decent bit on that flop. But since they were so short, it didn't really do too much harm in that case. But if you're deeper, those are the kinds of things you want to be aware of. So I definitely highly recommend playing a lot with pro poker tools in different situations and trying to put your opponents on ranges and see how you stack up. As you saw in those examples, most of the time, the equities are pretty damn close, even after the flop. Now, once you get to the turn, they diverge quite a bit more. So that's why in some of those sticky spots, especially as you're deeper, a lot of times it may make sense to pot control a little bit more on the flop and then see how the turn goes before getting a bunch of money in. So here's a strong high hand in the big blind. And this is one where had the button open, we would have been defending. So, but it folds around to us, that makes for a pretty boring hand. Over here, that's really dog poop kind of hand. Same with that. So the stats are starting to shape up a little bit for our players here. So Waz, you know, looks like has some idea what he's doing there. 29-11. Hazy Dave, 35-15, which is, you know, starting to get a little bit on the loose, aggressive side. I don't think raising 15% of hands is overly aggressive at all, but I think most players don't raise enough pre-flop, so that's going to tell us that he's going to probably be more aggressive than most of the folks out there. These guys raising 5% and 8% is more typical. Although I think raising 10 to 15 or maybe 18%, depending on the type of game you're playing in, is totally reasonable. I certainly wouldn't specify like an exact set of stats that I think you should play at, because for one thing, pre-flop stats just don't mean a whole ton in this game. They mean a lot, but they don't mean as much as they do in other games like Hold'em and PLO. But you know, most of your win rate's going to be determined by what you're doing post-flop. So over here, the suited ace-5 queen, definitely want to raise that on the button. Lately, I've always opened for 3.5 big blinds, almost no matter what, unless I was doing a min-raise from early position. Lately, I've been experimenting with just raising to 3 big blinds a lot, and I find that I don't think it makes too much of a difference in how many people call me. And it keeps the pot a little bit under control for the times you run into a big hand, but raising 3x, if you hit hard and they want to get the money in with you, you can still do that pretty easily. So over here, we hit nut nut, which is pretty nice. And I like to call. Generally, I would jam this. If this were heads up, I would throw in a re-raise because there are spades out here, and I'd hate to lose half the pot by someone backdooring some ridiculous flush. But we got Hazy Dave back here, and I really want to kind of try to lure him in because he's going to be getting such great pot odds to call, and then hopefully get the rest of the money in on the river. Although raising here is certainly totally reasonable. I'm trying to be a little bit tricky. But that doesn't work because he folds, and this is kind of nice. He pots into us on the river. What's he got left behind? 34. So here we can just stick the rest of the money in, and we're going to get a lot of calls because he's only got not much money left. We end up, I think we quartered him there. Yeah, so high and low. So that was nice. So he had a set plus nut low, or wheel plus set. I don't think it displayed any particular skill there. It's just, he happened to make a wheel where I had wheel plus 6-eye flush draws. So in this game, people hardly ever fold wheels. It's kind of like that theory somebody had with full houses where nobody ever folds a full house. Saying, oh wait, nobody ever folds a wheel. Even when it's pretty obvious that they're getting quartered. So over the right table had the Genius sit down. Got a lot of hands with him. Basically a solid regular. I don't think he does anything too outlandish. And you don't need to in this game to win the money, I think. Although the game has definitely evolved and you don't see as many of the just ridiculous fish trying to draw to second nut lows for all their money. The games have gotten a little better than that a while, but are a little tougher than that, but there's still lots of value. And most of these players, it's not worth your while to try to out-level them too much. I think if you take a pretty straightforward approach of playing good starting hands, using your position, controlling the pot size post-flop when it makes sense, and you do just fine. And right now you can see my stats. I have been playing pretty loose, 35-23. I don't think I was making too many, really, playing too many marginal hands. Maybe it was just the way my hand strength worked out. And over here, 29-14. That's way looser than what I normally play. Normally, I'm not sure what the average is overall. It was probably in the neighborhood of like 22-12 or something like that for 6 max cash. Alright, so I think we're going to play another hand or two, and then I'm probably going to wrap up this part of the series. See if anything interesting happens here in the next minute or two. Ferrick's basically repping a straight there. So that hand doesn't look too interesting. And neither does that one. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. If you got any questions for me, please post in the forum or send me a PM or an email or whatever, and I'll be happy to get with you. This was DanD, and I will see you next time.